I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I saw his headlights in the rearview mirror, I knew I'd lose my nerve and drive off a bridge just to end it. Lena's chest hit the steering wheel, knocking the air from her lungs. Through the spider-webbed cracks in her windshield, she saw it. A matte black silhouette. A car that cost more than the house she just ran away from. Great. I escaped a monster just to kill myself in a lawsuit. A man emerged from the darkness. He wasn't screaming. He wasn't reaching for a phone. He leaned against the crumpled hood of his car, the rain sliding off his tailored black suit. As he leaned into Lena's window, the light caught the dark ink of a dragon curling up his throat. "You're bleeding on my leather, Lena." He doesn't reach for her throat. He reaches into his jacket and pulls out a chilled glass of water, sliding it onto the dash, alongside a heavy gold coin. "Drink. Then we'll discuss how you're going to pay me back." The rain didn't just fall. It screamed against the windshield, a frantic percussion that matched the hammering of Lena's heart. Every time the lightning fractured the sky, the rearview mirror offered a jagged glimpse of the world she was leaving behind, and the monster still clawing at its edges. In the strobe light flashes of the storm, she didn't just see the empty road, she saw the ghost of an hour ago. She saw Shin Woo's predecessors in her life, the heavy shadow of her ex-husband standing over her in their kitchen, his face a mask of cold, familiar rage. She could still feel the phantom weight of his hand around her throat, the way the air had turned into a luxury she could no longer afford. "You're nothing without me," he had hissed, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle her very bones. "You won't make it to the end of the driveway." She had made it past the driveway, she had made it past the city limits, but the terror was a hitchhiker she couldn't shake. Lena shifted gears, the car groaning in protest as she pushed it through a deep puddle. Her shoulder throbbed where she had hit the doorframe during her final scramble for the keys. The pain was sharp, a white-hot needle that kept her from slipping into the numbness of shock. She remembered the look in his eyes when she finally fought back, not with words, but with the sheer desperate force of a creature that had realized its cage was finally unlocked. The road ahead was a blur of gray and black, a tunnel of uncertainty that felt safer than the house she had inhabited for years. In that house, every floorboard was a landmine, every silence was a countdown. Driving into a literal storm was a relief compared to the psychological hurricane she had endured. She gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned the color of bone. "Just a little further," she whispered, her voice cracking. The rear-view ghost wasn't just her husband, it was the version of herself that believed she deserved the bruises. As she pressed the accelerator, she wasn't just fleeing a man, she was trying to outrun the memory of her own helplessness. But as the headlights of a massive dark silhouette suddenly loomed through the downpour ahead, Lena realized that escaping one nightmare didn't mean the dream was over. Sometimes, to kill a ghost, you have to collide with something much more solid. Something with tattoos, a gold coin, and a deal that would rewrite the definition of safety forever. The steam rising from the crumpled hood of Lena's car mingled with the freezing rain, creating a ghostly veil between her and the man who stood watching her with terrifying composure. Shin Woo didn't look at his ruined luxury vehicle first, he looked at her. His eyes, sharp and predatory, tracked the way she trembled, the way her hand clutched her side where a dull throb reminded her of a boot's impact from an hour ago. He moved toward her car with a slow, deliberate grace, his presence radiating an authority that made the storm feel insignificant. When he reached the driver's side, he didn't pull her out, he simply leaned one arm on the roof, peering through the shattered window. The light from the dashboard illuminated the dark ink of the dragon on his chest, its scales shimmering with moisture. He took in the jagged cut on her cheek and the way her white blouse was stained with road grit and fear. "The front axle is snapped," Shinwoo said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that cut through the thunder. "The carbon fiber frame of my car is shredded. Do you have any idea what the repair bill for a vehicle like this looks like, Lena?" Lena swallowed hard, her throat feeling like it was filled with glass. I don't have anything," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I just need to go, please." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it held no warmth. It was the look of a collector who had found a rare, broken thing. "You can't go anywhere, not in that wreck, and certainly not with him trailing you." He gestured vaguely toward the dark road behind her, a subtle acknowledgement that he knew she was being hunted. "You've incurred a debt you can't pay with a checkbook, but I've always found that the most valuable things aren't bought with money." He straightened up and opened her door, offering a hand that was steady and warm. Lena hesitated, caught between the monster she knew and the shadow she didn't. But as the distant flash of headlights appeared miles back on the highway, panic made the choice for her. She placed her shaking hand in his. He led her away from the wreckage and toward a discreet black-painted door of a building that looked like a fortress disguised as a lounge. Inside, the chaos of the storm vanished, replaced by the scent of expensive leather and aged whiskey. The private lounge was bathed in amber light, casting long, dramatic shadows across the velvet furniture. Shinwoo gestured to a chair at the bar, his movements as fluid as a predator returning to its den. He didn't call the police, he didn't demand her insurance, he simply poured a glass of water, his gold chain catching the light, and began to observe the woman who had just crashed into his life. The silence inside the lounge was thick, heavy with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the faint metallic tang of the storm still clinging to Lena's clothes. Shinwoo moved behind the polished mahogany bar with a grace that felt entirely too predatory for the quiet room. He didn't reach for a phone to call the authorities, nor did he pull out a ledger to calculate the damages to his ruined car. Instead, his hand, steady and adorned with a heavy silver ring, reached for a crystal glass. The sound of water pouring was unnervingly loud in the stillness. Lena watched him, her breath hitching in her chest, waiting for the moment the mercy ended and the retaliation began. She was a woman who understood the economy of violence. She knew that when you broke something belonging to a powerful man, you paid for it in bruises. She braced herself, her eyes tracking the dark ink of the dragon on his chest as he leaned forward, sliding the glass across the smooth surface of the bar toward her. "Drink," he commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. Lena's fingers trembled as she reached for the glass. The water was cold, shocking her system back into the present. As she drank, Shinwoo didn't look away. He observed the way her throat moved, the way her shoulders stayed hunched in a permanent flinch, and the jagged purple mark ripening along her jawline. "I should call the police," he said, his voice a low vibration that made the glass in her hand rattle. Lena froze, the water turning to lead in her stomach. A woman, driving like a maniac in a storm, smashing into a $60,000 bumper. They'd have you in a cell within the hour. Lena looked down, her messy hair falling like a veil over her face. "Please," she whispered, "I'll pay you back. I can't go back there." "I know you can't," Shinwoo replied, leaning closer until she could smell the cold rain on his skin. "And I have no interest in the police. They are loud, messy, and they wouldn't know what to do with a girl like you anyway." He reached into the pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a heavy gold coin, placing it on the bar with a definitive clack. Beside it, he laid a small white envelope. "The police report is a dead end, Lena. But this," he tapped the coin, "this is a deal. I don't want your money, I want your time. I need someone in my house who is invisible, someone who knows how to keep their mouth shut because their life depends on it. You stay here under my name, and the man in your rearview mirror ceases to exist. No one touches what belongs to me." The subverted twist of his kindness felt sharper than a blade. He wasn't offering a way out. He was offering a different kind of cage, one lined with velvet and guarded by a monster. Lena looked from the water to the gold coin, realizing that the mercy of a mafia boss was never free, but it was the only shield she had left. The gold coin sat between them, a heavy, silent anchor in the amber light of the lounge. Lena stared at it, her reflection warped in the polished metal, while Xin-Wu leaned back, the shadows of the bar playing across the intricate tattoos on his chest. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with the weight of things left unsaid, the kind of gravity that exists only in the presence of a man who owns the air people breathe. "You're looking at me like I'm the police," Xin-Wu said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant hum. "I'm not. The police operate on rules. I operate on results. In this city, they call me the Ghost, because by the time you see me coming, the deal is already done." Lena's pulse spiked. She had heard whispers of the Ghost, the shadow figure who controlled the docks, the high-rises, and the very streets she had just bled upon. He was a myth used to frighten people into line, yet here he was, sliding her a glass of water with the same hand that likely held the city's throat. "The contract is simple, Lena," he continued, his gaze never wavering. "You don't exist anymore. To the world, and especially to the man chasing you, you vanished in that storm. In exchange, you become a ghost in my house. You will manage my estate, keep my secrets, and stay within the walls I've built. You move when I say move, you breathe when I say breathe." He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the bruise on her cheek, a gesture that was half threat and half promise. "In return, I provide the one thing your husband never could: absolute immunity. No one searches for what I've claimed. No one knocks on my door without an invitation. Your debt for the car is settled the moment you sign, but your loyalty, that is a lifetime subscription." Lena looked at her trembling hands. She thought of the cold, dark road and the headlights that were surely still searching for her. She thought of the monster who claimed to love her while breaking her ribs. Xin-Wu was a different kind of monster, one who was honest about his hunger. "And if I want to leave?" she whispered. Xin-Wu leaned in, the gold chain around his neck catching the light. "You don't. You don't leave a sanctuary until the danger outside is gone. And for a woman like you, Lena, the danger is never truly gone. You're trading a life of running for a life of service. It's not freedom, but it is alive." He pushed a heavy silver-plated pen toward her. The weight of the choice pressed down on her chest, heavier than the crash, more permanent than the bruises. She realized then that the Ghost didn't just want a housekeeper, he wanted a soul to guard. With a shaking hand, Lena reached for the pen, stepping out of the rain and into the dark, silent contract of the underworld. The drive to the estate was a silent blur of rain-streaked glass and the hum of an engine that cost more than Lena's freedom. When the iron gates finally groaned open, they didn't just mark the entrance to a property, they signaled the end of the world as she knew it. The house loomed out of the darkness like a sleeping titan, a brutalist masterpiece of concrete and glass that felt less like a home and more like a high-end bunker. This was the devil's doorstep, and as Xin-Wu killed the engine, the sudden silence felt heavier than the storm. Out, he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. Lena stepped into the cold air, her legs feeling like lead. Shin-woo didn't touch her, but his presence was a constant, invisible pressure at her back as he led her through a front door that looked thick enough to withstand a siege. Inside, the air was filtered and perfectly still, smelling of expensive wax and something metallic, like a blade kept in a velvet drawer. He didn't take her to a servant's quarters. He led her up a cantilevered stone staircase to a room that overlooked the rain-lashed valley. It was beautiful, minimalist, and terrifyingly cold. The bed was draped in silk the color of a bruised sky, and the walls were soundproofed to a degree that made Lena's own breathing sound like thunder. "This is your space, Lena," Shin-woo said, leaning against the doorframe. The gold chain around his neck caught the dim light, and the dragon tattoo on his chest seemed to pulse with every breath he took. "Everything you need is in the wardrobe. Don't wander the halls after midnight. My security team doesn't ask questions before they pull the trigger." He pulled a small remote from his pocket and pressed a button. With a mechanical hum, heavy steel shutters began to slide down over the floor-to-ceiling windows, sealing the room in total darkness. "You're safe here, Lena," he murmured, his voice coming from the shadows. "But remember, the same walls that keep your husband out keep you in." When the door clicked shut and the lock engaged with a final electronic beep, Lena sank onto the edge of the bed. Her fingers tracing the expensive fabric. It was a golden cage, a sanctuary built on the blood of the city. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the man outside. But as she stared into the pitch-black room, listening to the absolute silence of the fortress, she realized she was now terrified of the man who held the key. The transition from the silent sanctuary of her room to the living heart of the estate felt like crossing a border into a foreign country. Lena moved through the corridors with the ghost-like discretion Shin-woo had demanded, her footsteps swallowed by the heavy silk rugs. She had been tasked with the simple act of bringing tea to the study, but as she approached the double oak doors, the air grew thick with a tension that made the hair on her arms stand up. The doors were slightly ajar, casting a long, narrow beam of light onto the hallway floor. Lena hesitated, her hand trembling against the silver tray. From within, she heard a voice, not Shin-woo's, but a man's frantic, sobbing plea. "I'll get the money, I swear. Just another week, Shin-woo. Please, my family." "You made a promise," Shin-woo's voice interrupted. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was terrifyingly flat, a sound as cold and sharp as a scalpel. "In my world, a promise is the only currency that matters. When you devalue it, you devalue yourself." Lena peered through the crack. Shin-woo was leaning against his desk, the gold chain around his neck catching the light. He looked exactly as he had in the bar, composed, impeccable, and predatory. He didn't look like a man having a conversation. He looked like a god deciding the fate of a mortal. He reached out, and for a terrifying second, Lena thought he was going to offer the man water. Instead, his hand gripped the back of the man's neck with a sudden, violent precision. The sound that followed was a sickening dull thud, the sound of a head meeting the mahogany desk. There was no scream, only a heavy gasp and the sound of something wet hitting the floor. "Clean this up," Shin-woo directed his men, his tone as casual as if he were ordering dinner. He straightened his cuffs and turned toward the door, his eyes locking onto the sliver of space where Lena stood paralyzed. She didn't breathe, she didn't move. She realized in that heartbeat that the nurturing man who had slid her a glass of water was an illusion, a mask worn by a monster. The protection he offered wasn't based on kindness, it was based on the absolute, uncompromising violence he was capable of inflicting on anyone who crossed his lines. Xin Wu stepped toward the door, and Lena retreated into the shadows, the tray rattling. She had traded one abuser for a man who moved the very earth with his cruelty. As she fled back toward her golden cage, the realization settled into her bones. Her savior was the most dangerous man she had ever met, and she was now part of his collection. The silence of the estate felt heavier after the violence Lena had witnessed. She sat on the edge of the silk-draped bed, her mind replaying the dull thud of the meeting in the study, when the door to her room opened without a knock. Xin Wu stepped in, his black suit jacket gone, his white sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and more intricate ink. In one hand he carried a sleek medical kit, in the other a stack of soft, dark fabrics. He didn't ask for permission. He moved toward her with that same unsettling, predatory grace, pulling a low stool in front of her. "Look at me," he commanded. His voice was no longer the flat monotone of the executioner. It had returned to the low, resonant hum of the man in the bar. Lena obeyed, her breath hitching as he leaned in. She expected the callousness of a monster, but his touch was unexpectedly steady. He dipped a cotton swab in antiseptic, his movements precise as he cleaned the laceration on her cheek. The sting was sharp, but his eyes stayed locked on the wound with a focus that felt almost intimate. "The men who work for me understand fear," he murmured, his gaze finally shifting to hers. "But you understand survival. There's a difference." He set the medical kit aside and placed the stack of clothes on the bed beside her. They weren't the cheap, functional garments she was used to. They were high-end silks and cashmeres in deep charcoals and blacks, the colors of his world. "Discard the white shirt, Lena. It belongs to the woman who was running," Xin Wu said, his voice dropping an octave. "In this house, you don't wear the marks of someone else's cruelty. You wear mine." He stood up, his height looming over her, the gold chain around his neck catching the dim light. For a moment he didn't move to leave. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw just below the bandage he had applied. The touch wasn't a strike, it was a claim. It was the different kind of care she had never known, a protection that felt like a velvet glove over a fist of iron. As he turned and walked toward the door, the dynamic between them shifted. She was no longer just a debt to be collected or a maid to be hidden. She was becoming a part of the fortress itself. Lena looked at the dark clothes and then at his retreating back, realizing that while she was finally being cared for, the cost was becoming her very identity. She was no longer a victim fleeing the light. She was a woman being reshaped by the shadow. The sanctuary of the estate had begun to feel like a second skin, but even a fortress made of glass and cold stone could not keep out the poison of the past. Lena stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the upper gallery, watching the rain wash over the valley. She was dressed in the charcoal silk Xin Wu had given her, the fabric cool against her skin, a physical reminder of the deal she had signed in blood and water. For the first time in years, she didn't jump at the sound of the wind, yet the air in the house had suddenly grown thin, charged with a familiar looming dread. The sound of Xin Wu's footsteps, steady, rhythmic, and heavy, echoed against the marble floor before he appeared. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on a tablet in his hand, his brow furrowed in a way that signaled a shift in the weather. He stopped beside her, the scent of rain and expensive tobacco clinging to him. "He's here," Xin Wu said. He didn't need to say the name. Lena's heart performed a sickening roll in her chest. The rear-view ghost had finally manifested. "How?" she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "He's persistent, and he's desperate," Xin Wu replied, tapping the screen. "He's been hitting the lower-level bars, showing your picture, offering money he doesn't have. He tracked your car to the impound lot near the crash site. He knows you didn't leave the city." Xin Wu turned the screen toward her, It was a grainy surveillance shot from a street corner 3 blocks from the estate's hidden entrance. Even in the pixelated shadow, Lena recognized the set of those shoulders, the aggressive tilt of the head. It was him. Her ex-husband was circling the perimeter, a scavenger sniffing at the gates of a predator. "The walls are high, Lena," Shin-woo said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous hum. "But a man with nothing to lose is like a cornered rat. He's scratching at the edges of my world." "He'll find a way in," Lena said, her breath hitching. "He always does. He doesn't stop until everything is broken." Shin-woo stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, the gold chain around his neck glinting in the dim light. He reached out, his hand grasping the back of her neck, not with the violence he had shown the debtor, but with a possessive, grounding weight. "He thinks he's hunting a victim," Shin-woo murmured, leaning down until his lips were inches from her ear. "He hasn't realized he's walked into a minefield. The perimeter isn't just to keep you in, Lena. It's to ensure that when he finally crosses the line, there's no one left to find his body." Despite the warmth of his hand, a chill raced down Lena's spine. The walls felt like they were closing in, trapping her in a collision course between 2 monsters. One wanted to break her, the other wanted to own the pieces. And as the storm intensified outside, she realized the peace was officially over. The heavy, humid air of the estate seemed to vibrate with the news of her ex-husband's arrival, but as Shin-woo left to handle security measures, Lena found herself drawn to the one room she had been subtly encouraged to avoid, his private study. The door was unlocked, a rare oversight, or perhaps a silent invitation. She moved through the space, her silk dress whispering against the dark wood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. On the corner of the mahogany desk, beside the crystal glass he had used to offer her mercy, lay the heavy gold coin he had shown her at the bar. But next to it sat something she hadn't noticed before, a small tarnished silver medallion, half hidden under a stack of dossiers. Lena reached out, her fingers trembling. As she turned it over, the blood drained from her face. Engraved on the back was a date and a set of initials she recognized instantly. They weren't Shin-woo's. They belonged to her own father, a man who had disappeared years ago, leaving behind debts and a daughter who had been forced into a marriage to pay them. Lena's breath hitched. She realized then that the car crash hadn't been a random collision of fate. Shin-woo hadn't offered her a deal because he needed a housekeeper. He had offered it because he had been looking for her. The dossiers beneath the medallion were filled with photos of her over the last 5 years, candid shots of her at the grocery store, bruises visible on her arms, photos of her looking out the window of her old house, and detailed records of her husband's gambling debts to the mafia. "I wondered how long it would take you to find that," a voice drawled from the doorway. Lena spun around, the medallion cold against her palm. Shin-woo stood there, his black jacket discarded, the gold chain around his neck glinting. He didn't look angry. He looked satisfied, like a predator watching his prey finally realize it was in a cage. "You knew," Lena whispered, her voice cracking. "The crash, it wasn't an accident. You were waiting for me to run." "I was waiting for you to realize that I was the only one who could settle your father's debt," Shin-woo said, stepping into the room. He didn't stop until he was inches away, the scent of expensive tobacco and rain enveloping her. "I didn't give you a deal to save you, Lena. I gave you a deal to claim what was already mine." The realization was a second collision, more violent than the first. Her savior wasn't a protector who happened to be a monster. He was a monster who engineered her salvation to ensure her total surrender. As the rain lashed against the windows, Lena realized that the golden cage had been built for her long before she ever touched the steering wheel. The storm had returned with a vengeance, but the thunder outside was nothing compared to the violent tremor of the estate's front doors being thrown open. Lena stood at the top of the marble staircase, her hand clutching the silver medallion so hard it bit into her palm. Below, in the grand foyer that bled into the private lounge, stood the man she had spent a lifetime fearing. Her ex-husband looked like a ghost from a much lower circle of hell. He was drenched, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a manic, possessive triumph. "Lena!" he roared, the sound echoing off the soundproofed walls. "I knew you were hiding in this palace. Did you think a fancy car and a suit could hide you from me?" He took a step toward the stairs, but the air in the room suddenly curdled. From the shadows of the lounge, Xin Wu emerged. He wasn't rushing. He didn't look startled. He moved with a slow, terrifying precision, adjusting the cuff of his black sleeve. The gold chain around his neck glinted like a predator's eye. "You're dripping on my floor," Xin Wu said. The tone was flat, conversational, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Step aside, pal," her ex spat, reaching for a heavy glass bottle on a nearby console. "You don't know who you're dealing with. That's my wife." Xin Wu stopped just inches away. He was taller, broader, and radiated a predatory aesthetic that made her ex-husband's aggression look like the tantrum of a child. "I know exactly who you are," Xin Wu murmured, leaning in until his face was bathed in the dim amber light. "You're the man who broke my property. You're the man who thinks he can walk into my house and claim a debt that I've already settled." Before her ex could even raise the bottle, Xin Wu moved. It was a blur of black silk and violence. He didn't just strike, he dismantled. With one hand he caught her ex's wrist, the sound of snapping bone punctuating the silence. With the other, he gripped the man's throat, lifting him until his toes barely grazed the floor. "Lena isn't your wife," Xin Wu hissed, his voice a low, vibrating growl that shook Lena to her core. "She is a ghost, and ghosts don't belong to dead men." He threw the man back against the heavy oak doors with a force that made the glass rattle in the cabinets. Xin Wu didn't look back at the whimpering figure on the floor. Instead, he looked up the stairs at Lena. His eyes were dark, filled with a terrifying protective hunger. He looked like the devil who had just evicted a demon, and as he began to walk toward her, Lena realized the collision point was over. The past was broken, but the future was now in the hands of a man who didn't just want to protect her, he wanted to consume her. The foyer was thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of blood. On the floor, the man who had haunted Lena's every waking moment lay gasping, his power stripped away by a single casual display of mafia brutality. Lena remained at the top of the stairs, her breath hitching as Xin Wu turned his back on the broken figure and looked up at her. The choice she had been running from since the car crash finally caught up to her. "He's still breathing, Lena," Xin Wu said, his voice a low, echoing vibration in the hall. "I can have my men dump him at the city limits. He'll keep coming. He'll keep scratching at the doors. Or I can settle the debt once and for all." He reached into his waistband and pulled out a small, sleek pistol, placing it on the marble banister at the landing between them. The gold chain around his neck glinted in the amber light as he stepped back, giving her space, the first true choice she'd had in years. "If you walk out those doors now, you're a fugitive again," he murmured, his gaze intense, possessive, and yet strangely expectant. "If you stay, you're mine, but you'll never have to look in a rearview mirror again." Lena looked at the gun, then at the man whimpering on her floor. For years, she had been a victim defined by her flight. She had been a ghost in her own life, hiding in the shadows of someone else's cruelty. The price of freedom wasn't money, it was the willingness to let the old version of herself die in this foyer. She thought of the medallion in her pocket, the secret of her father's debt, and Xin Wu's calculated intervention. He was a monster, yes. He was a man who engineered collisions to claim what he wanted. But as she looked at him, she didn't see the chaotic rage of her ex-husband. She saw a sanctuary built on ironclad rules. "I'm tired of running," she whispered, the words sounding like a vow. She didn't reach for the gun. She walked down the stairs, her charcoal silk dress flowing like liquid shadow, and stopped in front of Xin Wu. She reached out, her fingers grazing the dragon tattoo on his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. By choosing him, she was choosing a different kind of cage, but it was one where she would finally be the one holding the key to the master's heart. "End it," she said, her voice turning cold and sharp. "I don't want to be a ghost anymore." Xin Wu's eyes darkened with a terrifying satisfaction. He didn't move toward the gun, he signaled to the shadows behind him. "Take him out," he commanded. As the whimpering man was dragged into the rain, Xin Wu pulled Lena into the heat of his chest, his grip a promise of total, uncompromising protection. The price was paid. The storm had finally broken, leaving the city below washed in a cold, shimmering clarity. Standing on the expansive terrace of the estate, Lena watched the first light of dawn bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of violet and gold. The air was crisp, no longer smelling of rain and desperation, but of iron and expensive ozone. She was no longer the woman in the torn white blouse, trembling behind a cracked windshield. She wore a tailored coat of deep obsidian, its silk lining a hidden luxury against her skin. Her posture had shifted. The defeated hunch of the survivor had been replaced by the quiet, dangerous composure of a woman who had seen the abyss and decided to own it. The bandage on her cheek was gone, leaving a faint silvery line, not a mark of shame, but a seal of her arrival. A steady weight settled against her back, and the familiar scent of sandalwood and tobacco enveloped her. Xin Wu didn't need to say a word. He stood behind her, his presence a living shield, his hand coming to rest possessively on her waist. The gold chain around his neck caught the rising sun, glinting with a sharp, regal light. "The city is waking up," Xin Wu murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "And they have no idea that everything has changed." Lena turned in his arms, no longer flinching at his proximity. She looked up at the man who had engineered her collision and realized that while he was a monster, he was her monster. He had provided the sanctuary she needed to put herself back together, and in return, she had given him the one thing his power couldn't buy, a soul that wasn't afraid of his darkness. "They'll know soon enough," Lena replied, her voice steady and resonant. She reached up, her fingers tracing the dragon tattoo that climbed his throat, her touch a claim as much as a caress. "We aren't hiding anymore, Xin Wu." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The golden cage had transformed. The bars had melted away, leaving only a throne. The debt was settled. The past was buried in the mud of the perimeter, and the fugitive was dead. As they looked out over their domain together, Lena realized she was no longer looking for a way out. She had found her place in the shadows at the side of the ghost. The new queen had arrived, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving the story, she was writing it.